Good morning, everybody, or good day if you're watching this in the recording. This webinar is being recorded. So welcome to the seminar, Seizing the Massive Opportunities of Cheaper Renewables and Storage from the Centre for Energy Transition at the University of Aberdeen. This is the first in a series of 4 webinars that are being organised in the run-up to and indeed during and after the COP26 conference that's starting next week in Glasgow. My name is Russell McKenna. I hold the Chair for Energy Transition at the School of Engineering in Aberdeen, and today I'm going to be joined by a panel of experts to discuss this topic of renewables and their cost situation. So, as well as myself, I'll be joined by Paul Dodds, who is a Professor of Energy Systems at UCL Energy Institute and the Institute for Sustainable Resources in London. Also by Dr. Magnus Harold, Innovation Manager at Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult. Henry Jeffrey is the Head of Policy and Innovation Group at the University of Edinburgh. And additionally, 2 colleagues from the University of Aberdeen will be joining the panel. Beth Scott is a Professor in Marine Ecology in Biological Sciences, and Dr. Astley Hastings is a reader also in Biological Sciences. So the agenda for today is that we have 4 impulse presentations from members of the panel of approximately 10 minutes, which will be followed by discussion amongst the panel. Just before we get started, in terms of housekeeping, so you won't be able to use your video or your microphone in the audience, but please do share questions in the chat function, and we will prioritize those based on the votes that they get and try to address those in the discussion. So without further ado, I am going to present to you a second. Okay, so I'm going to present to you about cost trends in renewable energy technologies, talking about progress from subsidies to grid parity, and hopefully by the end of this presentation, if you don't know already, you'll know what that is, and beyond. So just to set a bit of context for this seminar, I wanted to give you a bit of background, because we're talking about energy transition, but this is by no means the first energy transition that we as society has undergone. If you look at this long-term trend in primary energy consumption across the world, you can see that indeed we've had previous energy transitions. Wood, in particular biomass, has been used for centuries and still is in large parts of the world for decentralized heating and cooking. Then we had the transition towards fossil fuels during the late 19th and 20th centuries, as you can see here. Nuclear energy only really started to play a role during the 20th century. And then we have what we call modern renewables. Hydropower came about in the 20th century, but really what we're talking about today is the set of modern renewables, in particular wind, on and offshore wind, solar PV, and bioenergy focused power and heat generation. So that's the broader context for what we're talking about. And if we zoom in to the UK, we can see that in the last decade or so, the renewable electricity generation in the UK has increased by a factor of around 5. So back in 2009, we had about 25 terawatt hours of electricity from renewables, and today that is up around 110 terawatt hours. The main reason for that is the heavy or the intensive subsidy schemes for these renewables, which have encouraged investment in these technologies. I don't want to go through all the details of the different technologies. I mainly want to note the main technologies are. Those are namely on and offshore wind, as you can see here, solar photovoltaics, and various types of bioenergy, biomass, for example. When it comes to renewable technologies, one of the key metrics that we tend to use as researchers and scientists, policymakers, are the so-called LCOEs, levelized costs of energy. These are a common benchmark across different energy technologies. And what they do is, as shown in the equation here, they relate the total costs of energy output over the lifetime to the actual energy output. And they do this by adopting a discounted, what we call a discounted cash flow approach. So they do a net present value calculation over the lifetime of these plants and calculate the cost per unit of energy output, typically in kilowatt hours or megawatt hours, over the whole lifetime, perhaps 20, 30 years. And the main drivers for these levelized costs are the investment in the plant, so that the upfront cost, the capex, how much does it cost for 1 megawatt of generation capacity. Also the operational cost, that includes things like operation and maintenance for the plant, but also variable costs or fuel costs, if these plants have these, and obviously a lot of renewable technologies do not have variable or fuel costs, in particular solar and PV. Bioenergy is the exception here, because obviously bioenergy or biomass does have a cost, and the fuel does have to be paid for. And another key driver of the LCOEs is the energy production, the capacity factor. So basically how good the wind resource or the solar resource is, how full to capacity the plant is loaded, and this mainly depends on location. So where in the world or where in the country the plant is located. One thing we're really interested in today in this seminar is the massive reductions in cost or specific cost in terms of dollar per megawatt or dollar per megawatt hour that we've seen in recent years for most of these modern renewable technologies. So this is shown based on some data from IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency here, whereby we see massive reductions in costs for both offshore and onshore wind, and the largest reduction has been for solar voltaics. We talk about learning rates for technologies as shown here. Learning rate means the rate at which this cost reduces. Why does it reduce? Well, it mainly reduces through technological progress, improvements in manufacturing, in efficiency of technologies, in integrated supply chains, and what we call spillover effects, so producers and countries learning from each other. Renewables have had massive reductions in cost. The conventional technologies have not. This chart actually shows nuclear energy has actually become more expensive in this time frame. We see similar reductions if we look to storage, in particular lithium-ion batteries. We can see a similar trend if we look a few decades ago, back to the early 90s, that the cost per kilowatt hour of a lithium-ion battery, particularly on the logarithmic axis, has reduced significantly over this time frame. And so what has happened in many countries is that we've achieved what is known as grid parity. And this is illustrated here for photovoltaics, so PV, solar PV. And grid parity is essentially the point in time where the levelized cost of your PV plant equals the consumer's electricity price. So the price of electricity that you get from the grid is at or above the generation costs of your electricity from your PV plant. And obviously this incentivizes that you use this electricity yourself. In some contexts, we're also approaching the grid parity for battery systems. Obviously the temporal availability of solar energy means that you're not necessarily at home in the middle of the day when your solar panel is producing the most electricity, which means in combination with battery systems, you could possibly shift that to the evening or to the morning hours. And so LCOEs of, or LCOS, levelized cost of storage of battery systems, is on the verge of becoming or reaching parity with grid costs. So this provides additional incentive for exploiting, in this case, PV, but also any other modern renewables. If we take a bird's eye view across the LCOE, so this is some data for 2020, showing typical LCOE ranges in dollars for renewable energies, shown in the top of the figure, and conventional technologies to the bottom. This is in dollars per megawatt hour, and I don't want to really go into all the details here for the sake of time, but I just want to illustrate with the aid of this data that with the exception of rooftop PV, most of these modern renewable technologies are in the same range as most of the conventional technologies. And they include obviously fossil fuel-based power plants, but also nuclear power plants. So what is going to happen in the future with the LCOEs? Well, we're obviously seeing various drivers for them. As I mentioned previously, the European Emissions Trading Scheme is seeing high prices of carbon, the highest ever in euros per ton, more like 50 or even higher. And this is obviously a markup on, especially on coal plants. And another driver for conventional plants is obviously the fuel prices. We're also seeing the highest gas prices that we've seen in many years, certainly in the UK. So these drivers tend to push up the costs, the LCOE of conventional generation. On the other hand, we're seeing these learning effects of renewable technologies. So we expect to see it sometime in the future. It's a big question. That's why it's a question mark here, when exactly that will be. But we're seeing a convergence, and we expect them to reach parity renewables with conventional generation. It's uncertain due to fossil fuel prices, how they will develop, how technologies will develop. But at some point in the future, we expect to reach this parity. However, this LCOE perspective is an oversimplified one. And I just want to emphasize that it's not the best or the only way to compare technologies. The problem is that if you look at an end user's electricity bill in the UK, you can see all these different fractions. And essentially the LCOE only counts for this wholesale cost. So this is the cost of electricity on the wholesale market, which, as you can see here, accounts for just over a quarter of the cost. Then you have things like network costs, the cost to maintain and extend the electricity networks, operating costs for the utilities, for the actual companies that have to distribute and administer the billing processes. And then you've got other environmental and social costs. For example, the indirect costs that you and I as consumers pay for the renewables. And a few other parts there that I won't go into, but the point here is the LCOE really only measures the wholesale cost, so it doesn't include all these other parts. And that's why it's an unfair comparison to compare renewables with the end user price. Another reason is that you need to integrate renewable energies into your energy system, for which we have 4 different measures. We can expand or extend the networks, or we need to have flexible generations with existing power plants. We need to extend the installation of smart meters and intensify this concept of smart grid, so we have remote load management across the system, and virtual power plants speak to each other or communicate. And we need a lot more energy storage. This has additional costs, and these are known in the literature and the discussion as integration costs. So essentially, on top of the LCOEs, we have an additional chunk of cost, which accounts for 3 main aspects. It accounts for profile, the fact that, for example, as I mentioned, solar power has a profile throughout the day. It accounts for the grid extension, and it accounts for balancing the fact that sometimes the forecast for renewable energy generation is slightly wrong, and we need the power system to be flexible in order to balance this difference out. And with that, I'm at the end of my presentations. By all means, get in touch. I want to hand over at this stage to Paul Dodds, who's the next presenter, and I look forward to your questions in the discussion part.
Okay, thank you very much, Russell. Let me just share my screen with everybody. All right, oops. This page. So it's great. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk here. I'd like to build on Russell's talk by talking about energy storage for renewable integration. And I'm particularly grateful to James Price for some of the work that he's done, but also to a number of other people who contributed to the work that's shown here. But I take all of the blame for the actual content of the presentation, which they haven't seen. And as Russell says, one of the issues with renewables is that they're variable. The output is variable, and so LCOE as a metric tends to break down when as you increase the proportion of renewables in your system, because the integration costs potentially become higher and higher. And in the future, that's likely to be amplified as well, because electricity demands are going to become more variable. So here's an example of what would happen if we electrified a lot of transport and heating on a peak week. And the peak week we've chosen here is the peak week in December 2010, which was a particularly cold period. And we can see fairly large changes in electricity demand between about 80 gigawatts and almost 140 gigawatts over that week, and some very large changes during the days as well. So it often varies by 30 gigawatts in a very short space of time. And so we're going to have a system where supply becomes more variable and demand also becomes much more variable. With demand becoming more variable, we'll have periods when we have substantially higher generation than we have demand, because we have a lot of renewables on the system that are generating when we're not using electricity. And so that electricity will be lost unless we have some method of utilizing it. And that's where energy storage comes in. Now, we tend to think of energy storage on scales. And when we think of an electricity system, most people think of a transmission scale type system where we have some conventional generation, some renewable generation that produces some electricity. We put that into the grid, we store it as required. We also have some international connections, and then when we need it, the electricity goes to the distribution system. But of course, we can put, as Russell mentioned, the storage at the distribution system as well. So, for example, in the combined PV and energy storage systems that some people are selling these days. And once we do start to get to the distribution scale, in the future, presumably, if we have a greater stock of EVs, then we might be able to use battery vehicle storage as well, so vehicle to grid storage. So you can see different sorts of storage starting to appear here. We also have integrated storage with renewables has appeared in the top left-hand corner, where you store the energy almost as a precursor to the electricity generation, as opposed to generating the electricity and then storing it. And historically, actually, that's how our system has worked. So we've always had lots of storage within the electricity system. When people think of storage, they think of pumped hydro, which is a very short-term thing, high power. But actually, most of our storage in electricity has been piles of coal or reservoirs of gas. So we've stored precursors to electricity instead of electricity because storing electricity is expensive in comparison. And if I expand this diagram a little bit further again to look at the whole energy system, we then see other types of storage coming in. So we have gas storage, and that could be natural gas or particularly hydrogen. We have heat storage, and we have and that can be within homes or it could be at a district heat level. So we have these other types of storage which are potentially longer term types and have quite different characteristics to your power to power type electricity storage technology that most people think of. And we don't expect to see one particular type of storage dominate or even storage in one particular area in the system to dominate. We expect there to be a range of different technologies if we want to try to minimize the overall cost of balancing our system. The challenge is that although renewable costs have been coming down, bulk electricity storage is still expensive, particularly over long periods. Now, I've put down a number of figures here, and I've done them in pounds per kilowatt and pounds per kilowatt hour, so in power and energy terms. And that's quite important because the different technologies have quite different characteristics in terms of their costs. So lithium ion, for example, the difference between the power or the cost per unit of power and the cost per unit of energy is not too great. It's a factor of 5. For hydrogen, it's extremely cheap to store very large amounts, but it's much more expensive to do it in kilowatt terms. We also need to worry about the round trip efficiency of the storage. So lithium ion is very efficient. So 90% of the energy you put into the battery, you can expect to get back out again. In comparison, hydrogen is very inefficient. So if we produce hydrogen from electrolysis, from renewables, and we then use that hydrogen to generate electricity at a later date, your round trip efficiency might be as low as 35%. So that's pretty low. And that means that you're not going to be doing that on a day-to-day basis because your losses are too high. But since the cost of energy storage of hydrogen is so low, it might, despite the low efficiency, it might still be economically viable on very long timescales, so seasonal rather than day-to-day timescales. And that's a really important point, because different storage technologies work better at different on different timescales and can provide different services to the electricity system. And therefore, although most of the focus has been on batteries to date, it's likely, I think, in the future that there'll be a much broader range of technologies that are actually used in order to provide storage services to the electricity network. I'll give you some data here, but of course those numbers are changing quite a lot, in the same way that the capex, the capital costs for renewable technologies have been changing over the last 10 years. And in fact, this graph is already out of date. So we see lithium ion at £600 per kilowatt hour here, and it's already much lower than that. It's much closer to 100 than 600 now, even though we got the 100 down for 2030 here. And we can see all of the technology costs are changing over time, particularly in energy terms, but also for some of them in power terms. And that makes it quite hard to understand exactly what the best storage technology or cocktail of technologies might be in the future. Now, I tend to argue that storage is one of the hardest technologies to understand in terms of the future prospects. And the reason is that there's so many different characteristics for storage compared to other technologies. So here I've listed a non-comprehensive list of metrics that have been used within the literature to describe storage technologies. So we have storage duration, size, the charge and discharge duration, the number of cycles, the response time, the round trip efficiency, the discharge efficiency, the daily self-discharge, energy and power density, the specific energy and power, the maturity of the technology, energy and power capital costs, which I looked at previously on the previous two slides, and operating and maintenance costs. But there are other ones too. So it's quite hard to try to work out. It's a real challenge academically to try and work out the best role of storage within a system. I mentioned a lot of focus has been on large grid scale battery investments, and that's because quite a few have been deployed or are now planned. And as you can see here, these are particularly taking place in Australia, South Australia, in particular because that has a very, very high level of renewables and quite limited connectivity to the rest of the Australian networks, and also in California, where regulations require renewable generators to deploy storage. And these batteries are getting quite large. So we see in power terms, it was a big thing when we had the first 100 megawatt battery in Australia, but people are looking at 1500 megawatts. We're getting into gigawatt scale almost in the near future. So this is quite a change. But batteries tend to provide very short-term storage. So you can make a case for them in order to make a case for them, because the costs are still relatively high compared to other technologies, they need to be providing a service where they're charging and discharging very regularly. And they do that very well, of course, because they have a very high round trip efficiency. So they work very well on a day-to-day basis. They're very good for providing ancillary services to the electricity system. But what they don't particularly do is the long-term type of storage, when you start to think about weeks, months and seasons. And a lot of people are now starting to look at hydrogen for that, despite the low round trip efficiency. And one of the reasons is that we know it can work because we know hydrogen storage can work because we've done it in the past. So in salt caverns, for example, at Teesside, there's now several salt caverns that have been decommissioned. And you essentially dig a big hole in the ground, pump hydrogen into it, and then take it out as you need it. Okay, so the technology works. The question is what sort of levels of storage and what sort of types of storage do we need in order to integrate renewables into the system? So this is a study using the high-res model, which is currently at a journal under review. So please don't share these too widely yet until it's been reviewed. And what it shows is the cost optimal share of UK generation from renewables. So this is what proportion of total electricity generation in the UK is taken by renewables in a number of scenarios. Okay, so each one of these columns is a particular scenario, and you'll see there's 3 markers in each column. That's because this graph covers 10 weather years. So we know the weather varies from year to year, and that affects both supply and demand. And so what we've done is taken a pseudo 2050 system, and the dash shows the worst year for renewables, the red dot shows the best year for renewables, and the green cross shows the midpoint year for renewables, so an average year. And if we have some basic technologies, then there's quite a big variation between these. So the optimal level of renewables, for example, without a large increase in interconnection with Europe, varies between about 72% and 88% according to the weather year. However, if we do have interconnection, and if we start including more advanced technologies, which for the middle 4 is biomass with carbon capture and storage, and that's important because it provides a thermal generation, essentially 0 carbon or negative carbon actually, thermal generation on demand, then that increases the scope of the amount of renewables that you could include in the system. And on the right-hand side, if we add long-term storage as an option instead of just having short-term storage, then you can see that the level of renewables actually increases up to about 95%. So on a cost-optimal basis, and that's because you have short-term storage of batteries, you have the long-term storage of hydrogen, and you have some clever technologies like synchronous technologies to produce. What am I thinking of? I think they're synchronous condensers. So they produce a spinning reserve essentially using a small amount of electricity, which is something that's been highlighted as a potential issue with large amounts of renewables, and a reason for needing to continue having spinning technologies on the grid. But in reality, it might actually be cheaper to have bespoke technologies that just provide this service than to actually have lots of gas plants, for example, that are still on the grid. And if we look at the cost of these systems, you can see that as we add these technology options, despite going to higher levels of renewables, we actually reduce the overall LCOE. And this is the LCOE including the cost of integrating these technologies. So this is over all technologies, including storage. And in some years we reduce them quite substantially, but also as we add long-term storage as well as short-term storage, we also see that the range of LCOE according to weather becomes rather narrow over time. So we can trust. So we're less likely to have price variations in such a system. So I hope that I've managed to convey to you that storage is complicated, but that long-term storage and short-term storage and a mix of different storage technologies are what we will probably want to use in the future in order to provide the lowest cost electricity, which also at the same time increases the amount of renewables that we can put in the system. So thank you very much for listening.
That's great. Thank you, Paul. Let's hand straight over to Magnus Harald from ORE Catapult then.
Thanks, Russell. Can you just confirm you can see my screen? Perfect. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. I'm Magnus Harald. I work for the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult. We are the UK's leading technology and innovation centre for offshore renewables. I'm very quickly going to talk about how cost reduction has been achieved in the offshore renewable sector, particularly the offshore wind sector. It's something I could talk about all day, but I tried to summarise in less than 10 minutes. So it's just worthwhile, first of all, highlighting the fact that the offshore wind sector today, it's really something that's been hailed as a UK success story, and for many good reasons. We have 10.5 gigawatts currently of offshore wind capacity installed in the UK. That's more than anywhere else in the world and is enough to power 8 million homes. So we've already made great progress, and I'm pleased to say that the future also looks very bright for this sector. The government has committed to setting a target of 40 gigawatts to be installed by 2030, which would mean that capacity would quadruple in just 10 years' time. And some predictions suggest that if we really want to hit net zero by 2050, as much as 75 gigawatts of offshore wind will be required. So we've made great progress. We've heard a lot about offshore wind already, and you're only going to hear more about it in the future. In addition to that, the industry has created lots of jobs in the UK. It's brought fresh life into many coastal communities. These are areas often which have gone through periods of industrial decline, whether that was from previously having a shipping industry, shipbuilding industry, or a fishing industry, or even an oil and gas industry. So offshore wind is bringing new opportunities to some coastal towns and communities, and is really helping the UK level up. But it wasn't very long ago that a lot of people were saying, well, why are we building offshore wind turbines in the first place? That sounds like quite an ambitious thing to do, and how can that ever be cost competitive? And only a few years ago it was very much viewed as being an expensive form of energy generation, but the costs have absolutely plummeted in the space of just a few years, as shown by the graph on the right hand side. Projects currently being built today are set to be cheaper than existing gas plants, which is probably the cheapest form of fossil fuel generation. And of course, that means it's significantly cheaper than new nuclear too. We've had a long-term government commitment to the sector, both in terms of financial support as well as policy support, and that's really enabled the sector to commercialise with confidence to achieve these cost reductions. Even with that support, you still ultimately need to do something, and you need to find technological solutions, and probably the biggest of which is the fact that offshore wind turbines have been getting bigger and bigger as the years have gone on, and are actually only set to get bigger in the future too. Turbines in development today can be are predicted to be capable of producing as much as 15 megawatts from a single device. That would be enough to power 20,000 homes. And when you compare that to an onshore wind turbine that probably most of us are a bit more familiar with, the largest onshore wind turbine typically would produce less than 4 megawatts. So offshore wind turbines are sort of 3 to 4 times larger than what we see onshore in terms of their power production. Because the larger, they have access to higher altitudes, where wind speeds tend to be more consistent, and by putting them offshore in the first place, generally wind speeds are higher too. And a small improvement in wind speed makes a huge difference to the amount of power that the device produces. And because we've moved to bigger turbines, we can essentially install less at an offshore wind farm for the same power output than previously would have been achieved. And if you install less turbines, it means you've got fewer installations to make in the first place, which is a very costly part of any project. And then it also reduces the number of turbines that you then have to go in and inspect once the project is operational. So that's probably been the biggest driver. My organisation is very much involved in the role of innovation in the sector, and I'm pleased to say that innovation has played a massive role also in reducing costs in the sector. And it's something that, innovation has happened in all aspects of an offshore wind farm. Even before the wind farm is built, there have been innovations in the kind of survey methods and the project development methods. I've highlighted just a handful of innovations here, but there are many. Some things include making the turbines themselves more efficient and more reliable, whether that's state-of-the-art sensor technologies that report back on the health of the turbine, or whether that's some of the largest machines now don't even require a gearbox, so you've removed one system from your device and one potential failure route. Things in like the installation vessels that are used in these projects, they can now operate in a much greater range of weather conditions, meaning that you can get projects up and running and installed much quicker than previously. There are better weather forecasting methods for planning marine operations, so planning when your crew needs to go out to an offshore wind farm. That can be done much more cost effectively. And I've included a couple of images of some of the technologies that we've in particular been involved in. We're increasingly moving to remote and autonomous methods of doing things like performing site surveys or even inspecting a wind turbine for faults or defects. And even things like virtual reality is being used today to train offshore wind technicians to get them familiar with what they're going to see offshore before they actually do it. So once they do go offshore, they can perform the task much quicker. Just lastly, in terms of the future outlook, so the fixed bottom offshore wind sector, as I said, has been very successful. There are a number of other low carbon technologies that can benefit from the lessons learned in the offshore wind industry and follow a similar trajectory. I think in the first instance, we're going to see a lot more floating offshore wind. These are wind turbines that are placed on floating substructures and are placed in even deeper waters that are currently inaccessible by current offshore wind technology. The wave and tidal sector as well, I think Henry's going to talk a bit more about this, but this sector can certainly learn from offshore wind too, and is on a good trajectory. And already mentioned in the sort of storage side, there's increasing efforts being made in the production of green hydrogen technology and making that cost effective. Just lastly, while the focus has been on making the sector more cost effective, there is also now increasing focus being placed on making the sector more circular as well. That might come as a bit of a surprise to you. The industry itself is a very, very clean industry to work in, but there are always ways in which you can improve. Notable examples include making wind turbine blades recyclable, as well as using low carbon vessels. So whether they're hydrogen powered or have some kind of hybrid electric propulsion system. Okay, that was a very quick overview. Happy to take any questions in the chat. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Magnus. That's great. So now over to Henry for the final presentation.
Thanks very much, Russell. And can you just confirm that you can see my slides? Perfect. Okay. Good morning, everybody. My name's Henry Jeffrey, and I lead the Policy and Innovation Group at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm also a co-director of the ORE SuperGen programme. That's work I'm going to present today. The work that I'm going to present today is on the potential economic value of the wave and tidal sector, so building on the work that Magnus has just presented and showing what the returns could be if we have a successful deployment of these technologies in the UK, and it builds on work that my colleagues Charlotte Cochrane and Shona Pennick have done for the SuperGen programme. What I'd like to do is cover two main areas and then finish off on touching on the supply chain. So to begin with, I will look at the deployment and modelling scenarios, looking at saying if these technologies are successful in their innovations in the same way that Magnus described for offshore wind, what are the deployment levels that we see in the UK and internationally? And then looking at what the associated economic benefits could be in terms of GVA or GDP and jobs associated with the sector. And then finally touching on, do we have a fit for purpose supply chain in the UK in order to make sure that we can reap those benefits? So to begin with then, As Russell mentioned in his presentation about the levelised cost of energy, for an emerging technology where you're unsure about its performance and its reliability in its lifetime, it's really difficult to set what the levelised cost of energy will be now and what it will be in the future. Although we can do our analysis and forecasting, there is a lot of uncertainty there. And so in order for us to do reliable forecasting, we had to choose what the most reliable estimate would be of the levelised cost of energy would be for wave and tidal. And so what we chose to do was take work from the European Commission's SET plan, so the Strategic Energy Technology Plan for Europe has a section where they focus on wave and tidal, and they've set targets for 2030 of 100 and 150 euros a megawatt hour for tidal stream and wave technologies respectively. And so that's what we've chosen to be our inputs into what market share that we could have if we were to reach these cost points for these two technologies. What we've then done is partnered with two modelling organisations, the Energy Systems Catapult in the UK, using their ESME model in order to look at if we were to meet net zero and we were to have wave and tidal power at the cost points of the SET plan, how much domestic deployment would we have of those technologies in the UK. And then we've also partnered with the International Energy Agency, with the Times regional modelling team in Paris, to say if we take those same cost points from the SET plan of 100 and 150 euros a megawatt hour, how much deployment will there be at an international level of the wave and tidal technology. And so with those models run, you can see that if I show you the output here on the right hand side of the screen of the domestic deployment. So here you can see the energy mix that comes from that analysis, from the conventional conventional generation technology all the way through to renewables. And under that scenario of meeting the SET plan targets, there's over 200 gigawatts of renewables in the UK by 2050. 6 of which are from wave energy and 6 of which are from tidal stream. So a reasonable significant part of the energy mix. So I would say, small but still significant. If we then look internationally, then we can see that offshore renewable energy technology, which we're classing as floating offshore wind, there are just under 300 gigawatts globally, 115 of which are from wave energy and nearly 80 of which are from tidal stream. And so this is the first time that there's been a like-for-like comparison at a UK and an international level of looking at, if we meet a certain cost point, what would be the domestic and international deployments in order to look at the economic benefit. So the methodology that we've chosen, I've shown you the first step of looking at the deployment and modelling. We then go in, as Russell said, that levelised cost of energy is made up of a CapEx and an OpEx. How much does it cost to build the device, and then how much does it cost to operate and maintain those devices? We've then done a GVA analysis. Now, GVA is gross value added, or similar to GDP, and is the favoured metric of choice of treasuries around the world in order to make their decisions on where to place their investments. And then what we've done is looked at where that GDP exists in terms of jobs in the different components of deploying these technologies. So here we can see that we have, under the domestic scenario, we can see that if we meet these cost targets, then we can have between 5 and 9 billion of GVA to the UK economy just from domestic sales. So a significant industry against any metric there. But the difference that you see between the low and the high ambition there is depending on the success of our domestic supply chain in capturing the manufacture and operation of these devices. If we then move to look at for international deployments, you can see that there is between just over 11 billion of GVA for the UK economy under a low ambition and up to 30 billion under a high ambition scenario, when you take into account that we wouldn't only be deploying these domestically, we'd be hopefully having an export market, both of the selling the devices and for operating and maintaining the devices. And again, you can see, a threefold difference depending on the fit for purpose of our domestic supply chain on being able to supply that manufacturing and operation and maintenance skills into this new sector. But looking at that GVA and supply chain, where is the actual value? And what we've done is broken that down into the main areas of operating and maintaining a device. And as you can see, all the areas are by far from equal. And I won't go into detail here, but I think you can see, if you look at the top area of the graph in the light green, that's the operation of the device, operation and maintenance of the device, and you can see that is the largest category, followed by the medium blue colour on the bottom of the screen, which is the actual manufacture and supply of the generating device itself. So although there are a number of areas that add significant value, but by far and away the two biggest ticket items are the manufacture of the device itself and the operations and maintenance of the device. So making sure that we have a fit for purpose supply chain will be incredibly essential in sort of making sure that this is a successful industry, not for just delivering net zero, but also providing part of a green recovery, giving economic returns to the UK economy. That's really all I was going to say there. The work on the supply chain and how fit for purpose we are is ongoing. We're partnering with, in the first instance, for the Scottish perspective, Scottish Enterprise and Highlands and Islands Enterprise, who are doing analysis of both our device development and manufacturing capabilities in Scotland. This work will be presented to the Scottish Ministers Working Group later this year. Will be presented to Cabinet Secretary Michael Matheson, and we'll be looking at saying, okay, what are the infrastructure investments that we need to make in our supply chain, skills and training, and other infrastructure. So I will finish up there. I know we're running short on time, but to leave you, if we get this right, there could be over 30 billion could be generated to the UK economy from wave and tidal stream. It does require innovation. Meeting those set plan targets of 100 and 150 euros won't happen on its own. It will require innovation for that to happen, as we've seen has happened from Magnus's presentation in the offshore wind sector. Having the supply chain fit for purpose will be incredibly important to make sure that we can reap all of the benefits that we can from this sector. And the supply chain work is ongoing and will be presented to the Cabinet Secretary later this year. Okay, thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you, Henry, for the presentation. At this point, I'd like to ask all the panelists, please, to join me in this virtual space, and we'll kick off the discussion. Maybe I could start with a brief question to you, Henry, mainly, and Magnus. I mean, you highlighted some the expected contribution of different segments of the supply chain in your presentation there to sort of value added. I just wondered if either or both of you have some ideas or suggestions about specific areas in the UK where we might see this value creation focused, particularly with a view towards North East Scotland and Aberdeen, and for example, but also other areas. Would you like to comment?
I'll maybe start off, and Magnus can join in. But when you ask that question about sort of specific areas, I think there are a number of areas of Scotland where there has been historical manufacture, predominantly from the oil and gas sector. So whether it be in Aberdeen itself, or Ardeshir and Nigg, or Kishorn on the west coast, all of which have significant manufacturing infrastructure from the oil and gas sector in the 70s and 80s. I would say that I've looked at various innovation scenarios for the the wave and tidal sector, and of course offshore wind. And I think the important thing is that we focus on not deciding which region should be the heart of this technology, but making sure that the UK as a whole is the heart of this technology. So I think, you know, one of the most important things will be making sure that there is collaboration between the regions to make sure that overall the UK is successful rather than one particular region being successful.
Okay, Magnus, you're muted.
Marcus.
Sorry, unmuting now. Thanks, Henry, for starting off the dialogue. I'll maybe speak from a kind of Welsh southwest angle, because I'm actually based in Wales myself. There's a huge opportunity. I mean, there are huge opportunities across the UK. I mean, we're an island nation at the end of the day, and this is an industry that's touching most corners of the UK, and that's one of the nice things about it. But off the coast of South Wales and off the coast of Devon and Cornwall, we have the Celtic Sea. It's one of the largest areas that's kind of been penciled for floating offshore wind deployments in the future. Currently, there's no offshore wind, history in this region of the UK, but certainly a lot of developers are turning their attention because it is one of the best places in the UK to develop floating wind. That could transform places like South Wales, which is a very strong industrial heritage from oil and gas sector and the steel making industries. Both sectors have gone through difficult times, but one of the nice things about floating wind is that the turbines themselves and the substructures are assembled and built in ports. So the difficulty at the moment is that we don't have the right port infrastructure, but there are various dialogues going on about upgrading ports or getting the ports to collaborate, and that will enable us to capture much more of the local supply chain content in these projects, which, you know, these are aspects that in the fixed bottom offshore wind industry we actually missed out on, and hopefully will avoid substructures being towed in future projects. Okay,
that's great. Thank you. Yeah, I realised that was a bit of a open-ended question. So yeah, thanks both for your answers. Maybe Beth and or Ashley want to come in with some questions, either from the Q&A or your own ideas for the panel.
So I'm going to jump in with an LCOE question that has come in from our guests. It is, so those of you working with LCOE, if you can answer this, do you think that LCOE is still an appropriate metric, given that it can't capture many dimensions, such as the fact that marginal cost of intermittent renewables are virtually zero, but their generation profile is inflexible? So I think, Henry, if you can start with that, and then maybe Russell jump in on that.
I would agree with what the question is alluding to. I don't think LCOE on its own is enough, but I still think it's an incredibly useful metric in order to assess technologies against their competitors. But I think that more and more we are having to augment the LCOE metric in order to present a fuller picture, and so looking at the overall societal benefit, jobs and GVA to make a decision, looking at the LCAE as well, or the life cycle assessment as well of those technologies, in order to have a fuller picture. And so I would agree that I would say that LCOE on its own is no longer enough. It does need to be augmented, but it's still an incredibly useful metric, would be my opinion.
Yes, but I broadly agree with that, Henry. So, yeah, as I tried to illustrate in the presentation, it only accounts for a fraction of the cost of the whole integration, and we need to bear this in mind. Probably we need an enhanced metric, and that's what some of the research is around LCOE, is looking at, what's the full system cost in economic terms. But even then, there are other things that these metrics don't consider that we haven't really touched on yet in the presentations or the discussion. External costs of, we talked about carbon, but we didn't talk about any other externalities, potential positive or negative impacts of some of these renewable technologies, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, I think I'd like to come in on that a little bit because, you know, there's no such thing as zero carbon anything, because you have to manufacture all of the pieces of the turbine or any offshore installation. So I think you have to consider the amount of carbon that actually goes into not only the operating ongoing work that has to be done, like the boat movements and everything else, and indeed building the boats, but also the embedded carbon in the substructures of floating wind and the turbine blades. And also, this is where the concept of a circular economy and recycling turbine blades comes in, because turbine blades have an awful lot of hydrocarbons in them. And what do you do with them at the end of their life cycle at the moment? There's piles of them all over the world. So yeah, it's a big problem, and it's something that needs a lot of research.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Astley. Maybe in interest of time, I'm aware that some panel members have to leave. So there's another question from the Q&A that I'd like to direct to Magnus in particular, but by all means others if you have comments. And it's about emerging or promising storage technologies which are not yet widely adopted. So, you know, are there some technologies really quite even more nascent or younger than Tidal and Wave that Henry showed us in the presentation that you see perhaps in 10 or 20 years' time coming into the energy system?
I would say we might see tidal lagoons as well, potentially. So tidal range technologies. It's kind of a similar theme, I guess, but particularly something that's of interest in South Wales. The beauty of tidal, of course, is that it's predictable both in terms of when you have the energy and how much. We touched a little bit on hydrogen. We're certainly hearing an awful lot more of hydrogen. I don't know if that still qualifies as being new. It's very much flavour of the month at the moment. But there's discussions about, you know, converting power to other commodities as well. So such as, you know, ammonia would be another example. But those are some of the key ones. I'm happy for anyone else to chip in if they've got other suggestions.
Anybody else? No.
So I wonder, Russell, if we can ask a question, very popular question in the audience here, and I think, Paul, this comes towards you, it says, do you see in the near future houses with zero dependency on external electricity suppliers? And can we as householders become fully self-reliant, say with solar power, etc.? And also, what is that like in other countries, not just the UK? There's some questions about what would that be like in Africa.
So there's a number of questions there. So the first answer is yes, you can become independent using solar power, and you could do it in the UK as well as other countries, so it might be easier in other countries, particularly some more sunny ones. But it would be quite an expensive thing to become completely independent, and that's because you're going to have some substantial periods where you don't have solar power, where you need to store sufficient electricity to meet your needs over those periods. And you also need, if you have very high power requirements within your house, then you need to make sure your battery systems have sufficient power output in order to meet those too. So for example, if I lived in the south of Spain and I had a solar power, you know, where you have most of the year is sunny during the day, you probably have a limit on the power in your flat of about 4 kilowatts, because that's how the Spanish electricity system works. Then it would be much easier having solar power and batteries, and it would be much cheaper than if you live in Aberdeen and you have a standard 18 kilowatt limit on your house. And you might suddenly have demands that are much higher than what you can provide. And you can probably get to sort of 70–80% independent for a fairly reasonable cost, but that last 10 to 20% becomes really, really expensive. You need to have a lot of extra batteries in order to have not a lot of extra power, which most of it isn't used.
Okay, and if we've got a chance, there's one more question here that a couple of people might answer. It's about what are the main barriers to offshore wind expansion if they are so cheap and becoming cheaper to build. And I wonder if that could be said for everything. What are the main barriers to the expansion of renewables?
I'll start very quickly from an offshore wind perspective, but the main issue at the moment is that we're sort of approaching the limits of current fixed bottom technology. That can be deployed up to water depths of around 50 to 60 meters. Beyond that, you need floating wind turbines, and floating wind, unfortunately, isn't quite competitive at the moment. And the difficulty is that 80% of the European offshore wind energy resource is located in waters deeper than 60 meters. There are a number of other challenges. Grid capacity would be another one, but I'm happy for anyone else to chip in now too.
Yes, I'd broadly agree. Maybe I could add something about onshore technologies. I mean, a lot of my own research is especially related to onshore wind, for example, but also solar PV, and some of the barriers there are mainly non-technical. So we see that we've got these technologies in quite reasonable costs in a good location, but we have other barriers such as opposition from the local population. This idea of NIMBY, not in my backyard. So the population wants to have wind or onshore wind, but just not near to where they live or where they where they would like to go for walks and recreation sites. So certainly for onshore wind, that's a big issue. For solar PV, it's less of an issue. Obviously, if they're mounted on roofs or even ground mounted, it seems to be that that's not such a acceptance problem, because the impact on the landscape is a lot less. Anybody else about barriers? Okay. How are we doing for further questions?
Well, if we want to have one last question, maybe, or because we're a bit over time, there's a lot of support for this question. Are there any emerging promising storage technologies which are not yet widely adopted?
So I'll come in on this one. I mean, you could argue lithium batteries even, not particularly widely adopted, but they are starting to be. In the longer term, there's certainly hydrogen, I think, for storage, but you might have compressed air or liquid air storage, which has been around for a long time, but people are looking to make newer, more efficient, cheaper versions of it. That might be used in the future, and they might provide more longer-term type storage. I mean, if we purely look at storage technologies as opposed to storage technologies for the grid, so if we start looking at mobile technologies for cars, for example, then things like lithium air batteries, if we could make them work, then they provide much higher energy density, and they would give you a much better experience in vehicles. But that's not really specific. That's not an issue for the grid scale storage, where you don't worry about weight or volume so much.
Sounds good. Okay, thanks, Paul. Maybe just I don't know if this is a question or a comment, but maybe I mean, you mentioned lithium-ion batteries as an example. This discussion is focused on cost, but what about the more environmental or ecological implications there? Is any of us that are remaining here able to make a comment on some of the storage or renewable technologies, how they are from a more sort of life cycle or ecological perspective?
I mean, from a storage perspective, I don't think we have a very good. I don't think we don't have a very good understanding of the ecological impact. I mean, we know there's limits, for example, to the amount of lithium, and use certain amounts of precious metals that can be quite nasty things to actually get out of the ground and process. And so people worry a lot about, I mean, for lithium in particular, how to recycle the lithium and how to reuse it. In other batteries at a later date, once a particular battery is meant to come to the end of its life. So a lot of work has started going into that, because fundamentally, if we don't have some sort of circular economy around lithium, we're not going to have enough. We don't have enough lithium in the world that we, at least that we know about, in order to provide all of the batteries that we think we might need. So there's a number of issues there. On a life cycle assessment, we have very little idea. So and there isn't a huge amount of evidence out there. And part of the problem is that people are constantly developing new processes to produce batteries. That they're quite small, modular things, and so the LCAE can change quite quickly. So it's something that needs more work.
Lots of potential for further research there. Okay, thanks. So with that, I would suggest that we wrap up, given that we're already over time. So thank you to all of the panelists, those who are still present and those who have already left us. Thank you to you, the audience, for participating in all of your questions. We look forward to meeting you in a future event such as this. Okay, thanks. Goodbye.